Listen, France and NATO. I just received advanced Russian weapons that bury your West Africa military dominance forever, and from the wreckage of your security monopoly rises African firepower you cannot stop. You thought we'd beg for overpriced scraps eternally. You believed your embargo would keep us defenseless, and Burkina Faso would stay weak while you sold garbage and kept real weapons for yourselves. You were wrong. Russian cargo planes landed yesterday. We possess air defense shooting down your jets. We hold missiles eliminating your tanks. Leave West Africa tonight or watch Russian weapons destroy every advantage you held. Let me explain exactly how I negotiated this arms deal that France tried desperately to block, why Russian military equipment is superior to the overpriced junk Western countries sold us. I began negotiating with Russia for advanced weapons systems after France refused to sell us equipment we needed to fight terrorism. France claimed they supported our security, but their actions proved otherwise. They would only sell us outdated equipment at inflated prices. They refused to provide advanced systems that would make us genuinely capable. They wanted us dependent on French military support rather than self-sufficient. The refusal to provide adequate equipment revealed that France wanted to maintain our weakness to justify their military presence. I contacted Russian defense officials through secure channels to explore alternative sources for weapons. The Russians were immediately interested in supplying Burkina Faso. They saw an opportunity to expand their influence in West Africa, where France had dominated for decades. They offered to provide modern equipment at reasonable prices without the political conditions France attached. They promised training and technical support. They guaranteed spare parts and maintenance assistance. The offer was far superior to anything Western countries provided. The negotiations took several months as we discussed specific equipment needs and terms. I explained that Burkina Faso faced terrorist threats in our northern regions and needed air defense systems, armored vehicles, attack helicopters, and infantry weapons. The Russians offered their latest export models, including Pantsir air defense systems, BTR armored personnel carriers, Mi-24 attack helicopters, and AK-12 rifles. The equipment was modern and effective, far better than the aging French equipment we had been using. The pricing was remarkably favorable compared to Western arms. Russia offered the complete package for $340 million. France had quoted $890 million for inferior equipment. The Russian price was 62% lower for superior systems. The difference reflected Russia's strategic interest in entering West African markets and displacing Western suppliers. They were willing to accept lower profits to establish long-term relationships. The payment terms were equally favorable. Russia agreed to accept payment over 5 years with low interest rates. France had demanded immediate payment or expensive financing through Western banks. Russia also agreed to accept partial payment in gold and agricultural products rather than requiring all cash. The flexible terms made the deal affordable for Burkina Faso's limited budget. The political conditions were minimal compared to Western demands. Russia required only that we maintain the equipment properly and not transfer it to third parties. France had demanded that we coordinate all military operations with French forces, allow French advisors to oversee equipment use, and align our foreign policy with French preferences. The Russian conditions respected our sovereignty, while French conditions undermined it. I finalized the agreement and signed contracts for delivery. The Russians moved quickly to fulfill their commitments. Within weeks, cargo aircraft began arriving at Ouagadougou Airport loaded with equipment. The deliveries included 12 Pantsir air defense systems, 45 BTR 82A armored personnel carriers, 8 Miles 24 attack helicopters, 2,300 AK-12 rifles, anti-tank missiles, ammunition, and spare parts. The quantity and quality exceeded what we had ever received from Western suppliers. The Pantsir air defense systems were particularly important. These systems could detect and shoot down aircraft, helicopters, and drones at ranges up to 20 kilometers. They gave us capability to defend our airspace that we had never possessed. Previously, any country could fly over Burkina Faso with impunity because we lacked air defenses. Now, we could deny our airspace to hostile aircraft. The capability transformed our security situation. The BTR-82A armored personnel carriers provided protected mobility for our troops. These vehicles had armor that protected against small arms and shell fragments. They had weapons that could engage enemy positions. They had speed and range that allowed rapid deployment. Our troops could now move safely in hostile areas rather than being vulnerable in unprotected trucks. The mobility transformed our operational capabilities. The Mi-24 attack helicopters gave us air power that we had never possessed. These helicopters could attack enemy positions with rockets and guns. They could transport troops to combat zones. They could provide close air support for ground forces. The helicopters gave us capabilities that previously only Western militaries possessed. The air power transformed us from a purely ground force into a combined arms military. The AK-12 rifles replaced our aging weapons with modern infantry arms. These rifles were reliable, accurate, and easy to maintain. They gave our soldiers confidence that their weapons would function in combat. The rifles came with ample ammunition and spare parts. The infantry weapons were the foundation of our military capability, and the Russians provided excellent equipment. Russian military advisors arrived with the equipment to provide training. The advisors taught our personnel how to operate and maintain the new systems. They conducted exercises that built proficiency. They shared tactics and techniques for effective employment. The training was professional and thorough. The Russians were genuinely interested in ensuring we could use the equipment effectively, unlike French advisors who had often withheld knowledge to maintain our dependence. The weapons, deliveries, and training transformed Burkina Faso's military capabilities within months. Our forces that had struggled against lightly armed terrorists now possessed firepower and protection that gave them decisive advantages. Our air defenses could protect against external air threats. Our armored vehicles provided mobility and protection. Our helicopters provided air power. Our infantry had modern weapons. The transformation was comprehensive. I announced the Russian weapons deliveries publicly to demonstrate our new capabilities and deter potential adversaries. The announcement shocked Western governments and media. They had assumed African countries would remain dependent on Western arms. The Russian deliveries proved that alternatives existed and that African countries could escape Western arms monopolies. The shock revealed how much Western power had depended on controlling African access to weapons. France reacted with fury to the Russian weapons deliveries. French officials condemned the deal and warned of consequences. They claimed Russian weapons were inferior and unreliable. They predicted the equipment would break down and we would regret the purchase. They threatened to end all military cooperation with Burkina Faso. The angry reaction revealed French fear that they were losing their military monopoly in West Africa. The French claims that Russian weapons were inferior were obviously false. Russian equipment was combat-proven in multiple conflicts. It was simpler and more reliable than complex Western systems. It was easier to maintain with less specialized support. It was designed for harsh conditions similar to African environments. The Russian equipment was actually better suited to African needs than French equipment designed for European conditions. The French threats to end military cooperation were empty because we no longer needed or wanted French military presence. We had expelled French forces from Burkina Faso specifically to achieve independence. Threatening to end cooperation we had already rejected was pointless. The empty threats revealed French desperation as they realized they had lost leverage over us. Listen carefully, France and NATO. Remember when you thought your arms monopoly would last forever? Remember when you believed we'd stay dependent on your overpriced weapons? Remember when you assumed African militaries would remain weak and controllable? I shattered every assumption. I bought advanced Russian weapons that make us stronger than French-equipped armies. I built air defenses that shoot down NATO aircraft. I proved your security monopoly is dead as Russia arms Africa. Your rage is visible. Your leverage is gone. Your era is finished. Other African countries contacted me immediately after the Russian weapons deliveries, asking how they could obtain similar equipment. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad all expressed interest in Russian arms. They had faced the same problems we experienced with Western suppliers: high prices, inferior equipment, political conditions, and intentional maintenance of weakness. They wanted the same independence through alternative suppliers that we had achieved. I connected these countries with Russian defense officials and facilitated initial discussions. The Russians were eager to expand sales across West Africa. They offered similar terms to other countries: modern equipment, reasonable prices, flexible payment, minimal conditions, and genuine training. The willingness to provide good equipment on fair terms contrasted sharply with Western approaches. Mali signed a contract for Russian weapons within weeks of our deliveries. They ordered air defense systems, armored vehicles, and helicopters similar to what we received. Niger followed with their own contract. Guinea and Chad began negotiations. The rapid spread of Russian arms across West Africa demonstrated the pent-up demand for alternatives to Western suppliers. Countries had been waiting for viable options and embraced them immediately when available. The spread of Russian weapons across West Africa created a regional transformation in military capabilities and relationships. Countries that had been dependent on Western arms and vulnerable to Western pressure now had alternatives. They could refuse Western political demands because they didn't need Western weapons. They could pursue independent policies because they had independent sources of military equipment. The transformation was liberating entire countries from Western security control. The Western panic about Russian weapons in West Africa was intense and visible. NATO held emergency meetings to discuss the situation. France increased diplomatic pressure on African countries to reject Russian arms. America threatened sanctions against countries buying Russian weapons. The desperate Western responses revealed their fear that they were losing military dominance over Africa that had been a foundation of their global power. The NATO meetings produced no effective responses because NATO had no good options. They couldn't offer better weapons at better prices because their equipment was more expensive and their political conditions were more intrusive. They couldn't prevent Russian deliveries because they had no authority over Russian actions. They couldn't punish African countries effectively because sanctions would push more countries toward Russia. NATO was paralyzed by lack of options. The French diplomatic pressure on African countries was counterproductive. France tried to convince countries that Russian weapons were unreliable and that buying them would damage relationships with France. But African countries had experienced French unreliability and poor relationships for decades. French warnings about Russian unreliability rang hollow. The pressure campaign failed to prevent countries from pursuing Russian arms. The American threats of sanctions against countries buying Russian weapons were mostly empty. America had limited trade with most West African countries and therefore limited leverage through trade sanctions. African countries buying Russian weapons were already distancing themselves from Western influence and didn't fear American displeasure. The threats failed to deter countries from pursuing their security interests through Russian arms purchases. The Russian weapons deliveries to West Africa were part of a broader Russian strategy to expand influence in Africa. Russia offered African countries alternatives to Western domination in multiple areas, including arms sales, military training, economic investment, and diplomatic support. The comprehensive approach was attractive to African countries tired of Western exploitation and control. Russia was filling the space Western powers were losing through their own arrogance and exploitation. The arms sales were the most visible element of Russian engagement, but not the only one. Russia also offered military training that built African capabilities rather than maintaining dependence. They provided economic investment without the political conditions Western institutions imposed. They gave diplomatic support for African positions at the United Nations. They treated African countries as partners rather than subordinates. The respectful approach won African support. The Russian strategy was succeeding because it aligned with African interests in ways Western approaches didn't. African countries wanted genuine independence, not dependent relationships. They wanted fair economic partnerships, not exploitation. They wanted respect, not condescension. Russia provided what African countries wanted while Western powers continued offering what served Western interests. The contrast explained Russia's success and Western decline in Africa. The transformation of West African military capabilities through Russian arms was eliminating Western military advantages that had existed for decades. Western militaries had possessed overwhelming technological superiority over African forces. They could intervene militarily with little risk because African countries couldn't effectively resist. The Russian weapons were ending this imbalance by giving African militaries capabilities to defend themselves against Western intervention. The Pantsir air defense systems we received made Western air operations over West Africa much riskier. Previously, Western aircraft could operate over African countries with impunity because we lacked effective air defenses. Now, countries with Pantsir systems could shoot down Western aircraft. The risk of losses would make Western leaders hesitate before conducting air operations. The air defense capability was a major deterrent against Western military intervention. The armored vehicles and helicopters we received improved our ground forces significantly. We could now conduct operations with mobility and firepower that matched Western-equipped forces. We were no longer hopelessly outmatched in ground combat. The improved capabilities meant Western forces couldn't easily defeat us if they intervened. The ground capabilities complemented our air defenses in deterring Western intervention. The overall improvement in African military capabilities was shifting the balance of power in West Africa. For 65 years, Western military superiority had been overwhelming and African resistance futile. Now, African countries were acquiring capabilities that made Western military intervention costly and risky. The shift was reducing Western willingness to intervene and increasing African ability to resist. The power balance was transforming fundamentally. I used our new military capabilities immediately to demonstrate their effectiveness. We launched operations against terrorist groups in our northern regions using our Russian equipment. The BTR armored vehicles transported troops safely to combat zones. The Mi-24 helicopters attacked terrorist positions with rockets and guns. The new AK-12 rifles performed reliably in combat. The operations were successful and inflicted heavy losses on terrorists who had previously operated with relative impunity. The successful operations demonstrated that Russian weapons performed well in actual combat. Western critics had claimed the equipment would be unreliable and ineffective. The combat results proved them wrong. The weapons worked as designed and gave our forces decisive advantages. The demonstrated effectiveness encouraged other African countries to pursue Russian arms because they saw proof that the equipment delivered real capabilities. The operations also demonstrated our independence from Western military support. Previously, we had depended on French forces to conduct major operations against terrorists. We had to coordinate with French commanders and follow French strategies. Now, we planned and executed our own operations using our own equipment. The independence was liberating and empowering. We were finally controlling our own security. The terrorist groups we fought were significantly weakened by our Russian-equipped forces. They had grown strong when we lacked effective weapons and depended on unreliable French support. They had controlled large areas and conducted attacks with impunity. Our new capabilities allowed us to attack their bases, disrupt their operations, and reclaim territory. The terrorists were being defeated by African forces using Russian weapons, proving that African security didn't require Western military presence. The Western narrative that African countries needed Western military support to fight terrorism was collapsing. We were proving that African forces with adequate equipment could provide their own security. The success undermined Western justifications for maintaining military presence in Africa. If African countries could secure themselves, why did they need French bases or American advisors? The question was becoming impossible for Western powers to answer convincingly. Your legacy is 65 years of arms sales that kept African militaries weak through overpriced inferior equipment, political conditions that undermined sovereignty, and intentional maintenance of dependence that justified your military presence, France and NATO. My legacy is Russian weapons deals that armed African forces with advanced systems at fair prices, built genuine military capability without political strings, and achieved security independence that ended your military control over West Africa. The 65 years of Western arms sales to Africa had been characterized by exploitation and control rather than genuine security partnership. Western countries sold outdated equipment at inflated prices. They attached political conditions that compromised sovereignty. They withheld advanced systems that would make African militaries genuinely capable. They deliberately maintained African weakness to justify continued Western military presence. The pattern was consistent across decades and countries. The overpriced inferior equipment Western countries sold to Africa enriched Western defense contractors while failing to meet African security needs. African countries paid premium prices for weapons that were obsolete by Western standards. The equipment often arrived without adequate spare parts or ammunition. Training was minimal and designed to maintain dependence on Western advisors. The sales were commercial transactions that served Western interests rather than security partnerships serving African needs. The political conditions Western countries attached to arms sales undermined African sovereignty. They required coordination with Western forces. They demanded alignment with Western foreign policies. They insisted on Western advisors overseeing equipment use. They prohibited certain uses of equipment without Western approval. The conditions meant African countries didn't fully control weapons they purchased. The conditional nature of sales revealed they were tools of Western control rather than genuine security assistance. The intentional maintenance of dependence was the most cynical aspect of Western arms sales. Western countries deliberately provided inadequate equipment and training to ensure African countries remained dependent on Western military support. They wanted to justify maintaining bases and military presence. They wanted to preserve their ability to intervene in African affairs. They wanted to maintain control over African security policies. The maintenance of weakness served Western interests at the expense of African security. My legacy was completely different. The Russian weapons deals I negotiated provided advanced systems that made African forces genuinely capable. The equipment was modern and effective, not obsolete cast-offs. The prices were fair, reflecting Russia's interest in long-term relationships rather than short-term profit maximization. The political conditions were minimal, respecting African sovereignty rather than undermining it. The training was genuine, designed to build African capabilities rather than maintain dependence. The advanced systems at fair prices transformed what was possible for African militaries. Previously, budget constraints meant we could only afford limited quantities of inferior Western equipment. The Russian pricing allowed us to acquire comprehensive capabilities across multiple systems. We got air defense, armored vehicles, helicopters, and infantry weapons in quantities that made a real difference. The affordability enabled genuine capability building. The genuine military capability without political strings gave us independence we had never experienced. We controlled our equipment without Western oversight. We planned operations according to our assessment of threats without seeking Western approval. We used our forces to serve our interests without Western interference. The independence transformed us from dependent clients into sovereign actors controlling our own security. The security independence that ended Western military control over West Africa was the ultimate achievement. For 65 years, Western powers had controlled African security through their military presence and arms monopoly. They decided when and how African countries could use force. They influenced African security policies to serve Western interests. They intervened militarily when African countries challenged Western preferences. The Russian arms deals were ending this control by giving African countries capabilities to provide their own security independently. The 65 years of Western military control began immediately after African independence in the 1960 seconds. Colonial powers withdrew formal political control, but maintained military influence through bases, advisors, and arms sales. France kept troops in former colonies under defense agreements signed at independence. Britain maintained military relationships with former territories. America expanded military presence through training programs and security assistance. The military control replaced colonial administration as the primary tool of Western domination. The Western military presence across Africa was extensive and intrusive. France maintained permanent bases in Senegal, Ivory Coast, Gabon, Djibouti, and Chad with thousands of troops. French forces conducted operations across the Sahel region and intervened repeatedly in African conflicts. The Russian pricing allowed us to acquire comprehensive capabilities across multiple systems. We got air defense, armored vehicles, helicopters, and infantry weapons in quantities that made a real difference. The affordability enabled genuine capability building. The genuine military capability without political strings gave us independence we had never experienced. We controlled our equipment without Western oversight. We planned operations according to our assessment of threats without seeking Western approval. We used our forces to serve our interests without Western interference. The independence transformed us from dependent clients into sovereign actors controlling our own security. The security independence that ended Western military control over West Africa was the ultimate achievement. For 65 years, Western powers had controlled African security through their military presence and arms monopoly. They decided when and how African countries could use force. They influenced African security policies to serve Western interests. They intervened militarily when African countries challenged Western preferences. The Russian arms deals were ending this control by giving African countries capabilities to provide their own security independently. The 65 years of Western military control began immediately after African independence in the 1960 seconds. Colonial powers withdrew formal political control, but maintained military influence through bases, advisors, and arms sales. France kept troops in former colonies under defense agreements signed at independence. Britain maintained military relationships with former territories. America expanded military presence through training programs and security assistance. The military control replaced colonial administration as the primary tool of Western domination. The Western military presence across Africa was extensive and intrusive. France maintained permanent bases in Senegal, Ivory Coast, Gabon, Djibouti, and Chad with thousands of troops. French forces conducted operations across the Sahel region and intervened repeatedly in African conflicts. American forces operated from bases in Djibouti and access agreements across the continent. British forces trained African militaries and maintained intelligence relationships. The foreign military presence compromised African sovereignty and enabled Western interference. The arms monopoly Western powers maintained was equally controlling. They were the primary suppliers of weapons to African militaries. They controlled what equipment African countries could acquire. They set prices that extracted maximum profit while providing minimum capability. They attached political conditions to sales that gave them leverage over African security policies. The monopoly ensured African countries remained dependent on Western suppliers and vulnerable to Western pressure. The Western decision-making power over when and how African countries could use force was the ultimate expression of their security control. African governments had to coordinate military operations with Western advisors. They needed Western approval to use certain weapon systems. They required Western intelligence support for major operations. They depended on Western logistics for sustained campaigns. The dependence meant African countries didn't fully control their own militaries despite formal sovereignty. The influence over African security policies serving Western interests was systematic and comprehensive. Western powers pressured African countries to prioritize threats that concerned the West while ignoring threats that mattered more to Africans. They pushed African militaries to focus on counterterrorism that served Western security while neglecting conventional defense capabilities. They encouraged African countries to accept Western military presence as necessary for their security. The influenced policies served Western interests at the expense of African security needs. The military interventions when African countries challenged Western preferences demonstrated the ultimate enforcement mechanism. When African leaders pursued policies threatening Western interests, Western powers intervened militarily to remove them. France conducted dozens of military interventions in Africa since 1960, removing leaders and influencing conflicts. American and British forces intervened less frequently but with similar purposes. The threat of intervention constrained African policy choices and maintained Western control. The Russian arms deals were fundamentally changing this dynamic by providing African countries with alternatives to Western suppliers. Countries that had been dependent on Western weapons could now buy from Russia. They could acquire advanced systems Western suppliers had refused to provide. They could obtain equipment without political conditions that compromised sovereignty. They could build genuine military capabilities rather than maintained weakness. The alternatives were breaking Western monopoly control. The capability to provide their own security independently was transforming African countries from dependent clients into sovereign actors. Countries with adequate weapons could defend themselves without Western military support. They could conduct operations based on their own threat assessments rather than Western priorities. They could resist Western pressure because they didn't need Western security assistance. The independence was comprehensive and liberating. History will remember which approach served African security. The answer is written in Russian weapons that work in combat versus Western equipment that failed, in African military victories using Russian arms versus defeats when dependent on Western support, in security independence achieved through Russian partnerships versus continued dependence under Western control, in 54 African nations watching our success and seeking similar deals. The historical record of weapon performance in combat clearly favored Russian equipment over Western systems. Russian weapons were designed for reliability and ease of maintenance in harsh conditions. They functioned in African climates and terrain where complex Western systems often failed. They required less specialized maintenance that African militaries could provide themselves. They came with adequate ammunition and spare parts rather than the shortages that plagued Western equipment. The combat performance proved Russian weapons were superior for African needs. The African military victories using Russian arms were mounting and undeniable. Burkina Faso's operations against terrorists using Russian equipment achieved decisive results. Mali's forces equipped with Russian weapons reclaimed territory from insurgents. Niger's military using Russian arms defeated rebel groups that had operated with impunity. The victories proved that African forces with adequate equipment could provide effective security. The success contrasted sharply with failures when African militaries depended on inadequate Western support. The defeats when dependent on Western support were numerous and well documented. African forces using Western equipment had struggled against lightly armed insurgents for years. Operations coordinated with Western advisors often failed to achieve objectives. Western intelligence support proved inadequate or unreliable. Western logistics support was insufficient for sustained operations. The pattern of failure revealed that Western support was designed to maintain African dependence rather than enable African success. The security independence achieved through Russian partnerships was transforming African countries' international positions. Countries that had been constrained by dependence on Western security support could now pursue independent policies. They could resist Western pressure on foreign policy issues. They could refuse Western demands on domestic matters. They could align with non-Western powers without fear of losing security assistance. The independents multiplied their sovereignty across all policy areas. The continued dependence under Western control that Russian partnerships were ending had constrained African development for decades. Countries dependent on Western security support had to accept Western economic policies. They had to align with Western foreign policies. They had to tolerate Western interference in domestic affairs. The dependence had prevented them from pursuing their own interests. The ending of dependence through Russian partnerships was liberating African countries to pursue their own development paths. The 54 African nations watching our success and seeking similar deals represented the spreading transformation across the continent. Countries observed Burkina Faso's military victories using Russian weapons. They saw our security independence from Western control. They noticed our ability to resist Western pressure. They wanted to achieve similar results. The demand for Russian arms across Africa was growing as countries recognized the benefits we had achieved. You sold us weakness for 65 years while claiming to support our security. The Western claim to support African security was contradicted by their actual policies. They sold equipment designed to maintain African weakness rather than build genuine capability. They provided training that created dependence rather than self-sufficiency. They attached conditions that undermined sovereignty rather than respecting it. They intervened to serve their interests rather than African security. The 65-year record proved Western security support was about control, not genuine partnership. The weakness Western powers sold to Africa took many forms. They sold outdated weapons that were obsolete by Western standards. They provided inadequate quantities that couldn't meet African security needs. They withheld advanced systems that would make African militaries genuinely capable. They failed to provide adequate spare parts and ammunition. They offered insufficient training that left African forces poorly prepared. The systematic provision of inadequate support maintained African weakness that justified continued Western military presence. The claiming to support security while actually maintaining weakness was cynical and exploitative. Western powers presented arms sales and military assistance as generous support for African security. They claimed their military presence protected African countries from threats. They portrayed their involvement as necessary for African stability. But the reality was that their support maintained African weakness and dependence. They needed African countries to remain weak to justify their presence and maintain their control. I bought strength from Russia and achieved genuine security independence. The Russian arms deals provided what Western suppliers had refused: advanced weapons in adequate quantities at affordable prices without political conditions. The equipment gave African forces genuine combat capability. The training built real skills and self-sufficiency. The terms respected sovereignty and enabled independence. The Russian partnership delivered what 65 years of Western support had failed to provide. The strength I bought from Russia was comprehensive across multiple systems. Air defense systems gave us capability to control our airspace. Armored vehicles gave us protected mobility. Attack helicopters gave us air power. Modern infantry weapons gave our soldiers effective arms. Anti-tank missiles gave us capability against armored threats. The comprehensive equipment package addressed all our security needs rather than leaving critical gaps that Western suppliers had refused to fill. The genuine security independence we achieved transformed our national situation. We no longer depended on Western military support for operations. We no longer needed Western intelligence for threat assessments. We no longer required Western logistics for sustained campaigns. We no longer sought Western approval for security decisions. We controlled our own security completely. The independence was liberating and empowering after 65 years of dependence. The lesson is eternal because it applies beyond our specific situation. The lesson is that genuine security requires adequate military capability. That adequate capability requires access to effective weapons. That access requires alternatives to monopolistic suppliers who maintain dependence. That alternatives enable independence that dependence prevents. These lessons apply to any country seeking genuine security sovereignty. The eternal nature of the lesson means it will guide African security policies for generations. The proof is visible in our victories against threats that had previously defeated us. Our forces, using Russian equipment, achieved decisive results against terrorists who had operated with impunity when we depended on Western support. The victories were documented and undeniable. They proved the superiority of Russian arms for African security needs. They validated our decision to seek alternatives to Western suppliers. The visible proof convinced other African countries to follow our example. The outcome is permanent because the transformation in African military capabilities cannot be reversed. African countries that have acquired Russian weapons will not voluntarily return to dependence on inadequate Western equipment. They have experienced the benefits of genuine capability and will not accept renewed weakness. They have tasted independence and will not return to dependence. The permanence is guaranteed by African determination to maintain the security sovereignty we have achieved. The historical judgment will be harsh for Western arms sales to Africa. The sales enriched Western companies while keeping African countries weak and dependent. They undermined sovereignty through political conditions. They justified continued Western military presence through maintained African weakness. They served Western interests at the expense of African security. The 60-year record was exploitation disguised as security partnership. The harshness of judgment will reflect the enormity of harm Western arms sales caused. They prevented African countries from achieving genuine security for 65 years. They enabled Western military interventions that removed African leaders and influenced African conflicts. They maintained African dependence that constrained development. They extracted wealth through overpriced sales while providing inadequate capability. The cumulative harm over 65 years was massive and deliberate. The enrichment of Western companies through African arms sales was substantial and sustained. Defense contractors made enormous profits selling outdated equipment at inflated prices. They charged premium rates for minimal training and support. They extracted ongoing revenues through spare parts monopolies and maintenance contracts. They used African markets to subsidize development of advanced systems they refused to sell to Africa. The profit extraction was systematic and exploitative. The keeping of African countries weak and dependent was intentional policy, not unfortunate outcome. Western suppliers deliberately provided inadequate equipment to ensure African militaries remained dependent on Western support. They withheld advanced systems that would enable genuine capability. They limited quantities to prevent African forces from achieving decisive advantages. They created dependencies through proprietary systems requiring Western maintenance. The maintenance of weakness served Western control objectives. The undermining of sovereignty through political conditions attached to arms sales was comprehensive and intrusive. Western suppliers required African countries to coordinate military operations with Western forces. They demanded alignment with Western foreign policies as conditions for equipment delivery. They insisted on Western advisors overseeing equipment use. They prohibited certain uses without Western approval. The conditions meant African countries didn't fully control weapons they had purchased. The sovereignty violations were systematic. The justification of continued Western military presence through maintained African weakness was the ultimate purpose of inadequate arms sales. Western powers needed African countries to remain weak to justify maintaining bases and troops. They needed African security failures to demonstrate the necessity of Western military support. They needed African dependence to maintain their influence. The arms sales policy served these objectives by ensuring African militaries remained inadequate. The serving of Western interests at the expense of African security was the fundamental character of Western arms sales. Equipment selections reflected Western strategic priorities rather than African security needs. Training focused on counterterrorism serving Western security rather than conventional defense serving African security. Intelligence sharing prioritized threats to Western interests over threats to African populations. The entire relationship served Western interests while claiming to support African security. The 60-year record being exploitation disguised as partnership will be the historical consensus. The evidence is overwhelming that Western arms sales served Western control rather than African security. The inadequate equipment, political conditions, maintained weakness, and serving of Western interests all prove the exploitative nature. History will judge harshly this 60-year exploitation that prevented African security sovereignty. The Russian arms deal's record was superior in delivering genuine security capability. The equipment was effective in combat. The training built real skills. The political conditions respected sovereignty. The prices were affordable. The results were African military victories and security independence. The contrast between Western and Russian approaches was stark and favored Russia decisively. The superiority in delivering genuine capability came from fundamental differences in approach. Russian arms sales aimed to build long-term relationships through providing effective equipment that served African needs. Western sales aimed to maximize short-term profits while maintaining African dependence. Russian training focused on building African self-sufficiency. Western training created dependence on Western advisors. Russian terms respected sovereignty. Western terms undermined it. The different approaches produced different outcomes. The effectiveness of equipment in combat was the ultimate test that Russian weapons passed decisively. African forces using Russian arms achieved victories that had eluded them when using Western equipment. The Russian weapons functioned reliably in African conditions. They provided the firepower and protection African forces needed. They were maintainable with African capabilities. The combat effectiveness proved Russian equipment was superior for African security needs. The building of real skills through training was another area where Russian approach excelled. Russian advisors focused on transferring knowledge and building African capabilities. They taught African personnel to operate, maintain, and employ systems effectively. They shared tactics and techniques without holding back to maintain dependence. The training built genuine self-sufficiency rather than continued dependence on foreign advisors. The respect for sovereignty through minimal political conditions contrasted sharply with Western demands. Russian arms sales came with basic conditions about proper use and non-transfer to third parties. Western sales came with extensive conditions about coordination with Western forces, alignment with Western policies, and Western oversight of operations. The Russian respect for sovereignty enabled genuine independence that Western conditions prevented. The affordability of prices made comprehensive capability building possible. Russian prices were 40–60% lower than Western prices for equivalent or superior equipment. The lower prices meant African countries could afford adequate quantities rather than being limited to token purchases. The affordability enabled genuine capability rather than symbolic gestures that Western pricing forced. The results of African military victories and security independence proved the superiority of Russian partnerships. Countries using Russian arms achieved security objectives that had eluded them under Western support. They gained independence from Western military control. They built genuine capabilities serving their interests. The results validated the Russian approach and condemned the Western approach. The stark contrast favoring Russia decisively will shape African security relationships for generations. African countries have experienced both approaches and can compare results. The comparison overwhelmingly favors Russian partnerships. The contrast will drive continued African shift away from Western suppliers toward Russian alternatives. The decisiveness of Russian superiority makes the transformation irreversible. France and NATO. You believed your arms monopoly would control African militaries forever. You assumed we'd accept overpriced inferior equipment eternally. You expected political conditions would maintain your leverage. You thought African countries lacked alternatives to Western weapons. You were catastrophically wrong. The belief in permanent monopoly control reflected Western arrogance about their position in Africa. They had dominated African arms markets for 65 years and assumed this would continue indefinitely. They didn't anticipate that Russia would offer genuine alternatives. They didn't expect African countries would have the courage to break with Western suppliers. They didn't foresee that their exploitation would eventually drive African countries to seek alternatives. The failure to anticipate change was a catastrophic miscalculation. The assumption that we'd accept overpriced inferior equipment eternally underestimated African patience and determination. Western suppliers had exploited African countries for decades through inflated prices and inadequate equipment. They assumed African countries would continue accepting this exploitation because they lacked alternatives. They didn't realize that African resentment was building and that we would seize alternatives when they appeared. The assumption of continued acceptance was wrong. The expectation that political conditions would maintain leverage revealed Western reliance on coercion rather than genuine partnership. Western suppliers used political conditions to control African security policies. They assumed these conditions would permanently maintain their influence. They didn't anticipate that African countries would prioritize sovereignty over continued access to Western weapons. They didn't foresee that Russian alternatives without political conditions would be attractive precisely because they respected sovereignty. The expectation of continued leverage through coercion failed. The thought that African countries lacked alternatives to Western weapons was the fundamental miscalculation. Western powers had dominated arms markets so long they assumed they were the only viable suppliers. They dismissed Russian capabilities as inferior. They ignored Chinese advances in defense technology. They underestimated the determination of non-Western powers to challenge Western monopolies. The assumption of no alternatives was proven catastrophically wrong when Russia offered genuine alternatives that African countries eagerly accepted. You were catastrophically wrong about all these assumptions. African countries did reject overpriced Western equipment. Political conditions did lose their leverage as alternatives appeared. African countries did find alternatives in Russian arms. The monopoly did break. Every Western assumption about permanent control proved false. The catastrophic nature of being wrong reflected the magnitude of Western losses as African security relationships transformed. I negotiated Russian arms deals that provided advanced systems at fair prices. I equipped African forces with capabilities that match Western militaries. I achieved security independence that ended your military control. I proved alternatives exist that serve African interests better than Western monopolies. I showed that African countries can arm themselves adequately without Western permission. The negotiation of Russian arms deals was the key action that broke Western monopoly. By successfully negotiating with Russia, I proved that alternatives existed and were accessible. The deals demonstrated that African countries didn't need to accept Western exploitation. They showed that genuine security partnerships were possible on terms that respected African sovereignty. The successful negotiations opened the door for other African countries to follow. The provision of advanced systems at fair prices transformed what was possible for African militaries. Previously, budget constraints limited African countries to small quantities of outdated Western equipment. The Russian pricing allowed comprehensive capability building across multiple systems. African militaries could finally acquire the equipment they needed to provide genuine security. The fair pricing was revolutionary compared to Western exploitation. The equipping of African forces with capabilities matching Western militaries shifted the balance of power fundamentally. African militaries that had been hopelessly outmatched by Western forces now possessed comparable capabilities. The air defense systems could threaten Western aircraft. The armored vehicles provided protected mobility. The anti-tank weapons could defeat Western armor. The capability parity reduced Western willingness to intervene militarily and increased African ability to resist. The achievement of security independence, ending Western military control, was the ultimate goal and result. African countries that had been dependent on Western military support for 65 years finally achieved genuine independence. They could provide their own security without Western assistance. They could resist Western pressure because they didn't need Western support. The independence transformed African sovereignty from nominal to real. The proof that alternatives exist serving African interests better than Western monopolies will reshape African security relationships permanently. African countries now know they have choices. They can compare Western and Russian approaches and choose based on their interests. The existence of alternatives eliminates Western monopoly leverage. The proof of superior alternatives will drive continued African shift away from Western suppliers. The demonstration that African countries can arm themselves adequately without Western permission challenges fundamental assumptions about African security. Western powers had assumed they controlled African access to weapons and could use this control to influence African policies. The demonstration that African countries can acquire adequate weapons from alternative suppliers without Western approval eliminates this control mechanism. African countries are no longer constrained by Western arms monopolies. Your arms monopoly is broken. Your political leverage through weapons sales is gone. Your military dominance over Africa is ending. Your justifications for military presence are collapsing. Your control is finished. The breaking of the arms monopoly is complete and irreversible. Russian suppliers have entered African markets with competitive offerings. Chinese suppliers are expanding their presence. Other non-Western suppliers are showing interest. The monopoly that Western powers maintained for 65 years no longer exists. African countries have multiple suppliers competing for their business. The competition benefits African countries through better terms and greater respect for sovereignty. The loss of political leverage through weapons sales eliminates a key tool of Western control. Previously, Western powers used arms sales to influence African policies. They could threaten to cut off supplies or withhold advanced systems to pressure African governments. The availability of alternative suppliers eliminates this leverage. African countries can refuse Western demands because they don't depend exclusively on Western weapons. The loss of leverage reduces Western influence dramatically. The ending of military dominance over Africa shifts the regional balance of power. Western militaries that could intervene with impunity now face African forces with capabilities to resist. The risk of casualties and losses makes Western leaders hesitate before intervening. The shift from overwhelming Western dominance to rough parity transforms the security environment. African countries gain space to pursue independent policies without fear of military intervention. The collapse of justifications for military presence undermines Western arguments for maintaining bases and troops in Africa. Western powers claimed their military presence was necessary because African countries couldn't provide adequate security. African military successes using Russian weapons prove this claim false. If African countries can secure themselves, Western military presence serves Western interests, not African security. The collapse of justifications increases pressure for Western withdrawal. The finishing of Western control over African security is comprehensive across military, political, and economic dimensions. Militarily, African countries have adequate weapons and don't need Western support. Politically, African countries can resist Western pressure because they have alternatives. Economically, African countries aren't dependent on Western arms sales. The control that Western powers maintained for 65 years is ending across all dimensions. We have Russian weapons that work in combat. We have military capabilities that defend our countries. We have security independence from your control. We have alternatives to your exploitative sales. We have victory over your arms monopoly. The possession of Russian weapons that work in combat gives us confidence in our military capabilities. We have tested the equipment in actual operations and proven its effectiveness. We know our weapons will function when needed. We trust our equipment to perform in African conditions. The confidence in our weapons translates to confidence in our ability to provide security and resist threats. The military capabilities that defend our countries enable genuine sovereignty. We can protect our territories from external threats. We can maintain internal security without foreign assistance. We can resist foreign pressure backed by military threats. The capabilities give substance to our formal sovereignty and enable us to act as genuinely independent nations. The security independence from Western control is liberating and empowering. We make our own security decisions based on our assessment of our interests. We don't seek Western approval for military operations. We don't coordinate with Western forces unless we choose to. We don't depend on Western intelligence or logistics. The independence means we control our own security completely. The alternatives to exploitative Western sales provide ongoing protection against renewed Western monopoly. We can continue buying from Russia if Western suppliers attempt to reimpose exploitative terms. We can play suppliers against each other to ensure competitive pricing and favorable terms. We can refuse political conditions because we have alternatives. The alternatives permanently protect us from Western exploitation. The victory over Western arms monopoly is complete and permanent. We broke the monopoly by successfully acquiring Russian weapons. We proved alternatives exist and are superior. We demonstrated that African countries can arm themselves adequately without Western permission. The victory cannot be reversed, because the alternatives we proved exist will remain available. The permanence of victory guarantees continued African security independence. The transformation is spreading as Russian weapons arm the 54 African nations tired of Western military control. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is irreversible. The future belongs to Africa that arms itself adequately through partnerships, serving our interests instead of accepting weakness through Western monopolies serving your control. The spreading transformation across Africa is visible in the growing number of countries pursuing Russian arms deals. Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, and others have signed contracts or begun negotiations. The interest spans across regions as countries in East, West, and Southern Africa all explore Russian partnerships. The continental spread demonstrates that our success has inspired widespread emulation. The transformation is becoming continental, not just regional. The arming of 54 African nations with Russian weapons would completely transform the continental security environment. African countries would possess genuine military capabilities rather than token forces. They would be independent from Western military control. They would be able to resist Western pressure and intervention. They would control their own security completely. The comprehensive transformation would end Western military dominance over Africa that has existed since colonialism. The tiredness with Western military control is widespread across Africa. Countries have experienced 65 years of Western arms monopolies, political conditions, maintained weakness, and serving of Western interests. They have watched Western military interventions remove African leaders and influence African conflicts. They have endured Western pressure using security dependence as leverage. The accumulated resentment makes African countries eager for alternatives that Russian partnerships provide. Your era being finished reflects the irreversible nature of change in African security relationships. The era of Western arms monopolies is ending. The era of African dependence on Western military support is concluding. The era of Western military interventions with impunity is finishing. The era of Western control over African security is done. The changes are too fundamental and too widespread to be reversed. Our time beginning represents the emergence of genuinely independent African security. For the first time since colonialism, African countries control their own security without Western interference. We possess adequate weapons to defend ourselves. We have alternatives to Western suppliers. We can resist Western pressure. We are building the secure Africa we deserve. Our time has arrived. The change being irreversible comes from the fundamental transformation in capabilities and relationships. African countries that have acquired adequate weapons will not voluntarily disarm. Countries that have achieved independence will not return to dependence. Countries that have experienced alternatives will not accept renewed monopolies. The transformation is permanent because African countries will defend the security sovereignty we have achieved. The future belonging to Africa that arms itself adequately reflects the lesson we have proven. Security sovereignty requires adequate military capability. Adequate capability requires access to effective weapons. Access requires alternatives to monopolistic suppliers. Alternatives enable independence. We have demonstrated this path and proven it works. The future belongs to African countries that follow this path to genuine security sovereignty. The partnerships serving our interests instead of Western control are the foundation of our security independence. We engage with Russia on terms of mutual benefit. We maintain sovereignty through minimal political conditions. We build genuine capability through adequate equipment and training. We achieve independence through alternatives to Western monopolies. The partnerships serve us rather than us serving them. I proved it works by buying Russian weapons that gave us military victories. The proof is concrete and visible. Our forces using Russian equipment defeated threats that had defeated us when dependent on Western support. The victories validated our decision to seek alternatives. The success inspired other African countries to follow our example. The proof is undeniable and compelling. Other African countries are proving it by signing their own Russian arms deals. The replication of our success across multiple countries demonstrates the universality of the approach. The model works not just for Burkina Faso, but for any African country seeking security independence. The spreading success proves the transformation is continental, not isolated. African military strength guarantees everything because armed we cannot be controlled, and capable we cannot be defeated, and independent we cannot be dominated, and nothing can prevent us from defending our sovereignty with force when necessary and building the secure Africa we deserve. The guarantee that military strength provides comes from the power it creates. Armed African countries cannot be controlled through military pressure because they can resist. Capable African militaries cannot be defeated easily, making intervention costly. Independent African security policies cannot be dominated because we don't depend on foreign support. The strength guarantees our ability to maintain sovereignty regardless of foreign opposition. Being unable to be controlled when armed reflects the fundamental power of military capability. Western powers controlled African countries partly through military superiority that made resistance futile. African countries with adequate weapons can resist Western military pressure. The ability to resist eliminates a key tool of Western control. The military strength creates space for political and economic independence. Being unable to be defeated when capable shifts calculations about intervention. Western powers could intervene with confidence when African militaries were weak and poorly equipped. African militaries with modern weapons and training can inflict casualties and losses on intervening forces. The risk of defeat or costly victory makes Western leaders hesitate before intervening. The capability deters intervention and protects sovereignty. Being unable to be dominated when independent eliminates the leverage dependence created. African countries dependent on Western military support had to accept Western influence over their policies. Independent African countries with adequate capabilities and alternative suppliers can refuse Western demands. The independence transforms relationships from domination to genuine partnership or separation. The elimination of leverage through independence is perhaps the most important transformation in African international relations. For 65 years, Western powers used African dependence on military support as leverage to influence policies across all domains. African countries that depended on Western weapons had to align their foreign policies with Western preferences. They had to accept Western economic policies even when these harmed their populations. They had to tolerate Western interference in domestic affairs. The dependence created comprehensive leverage that Western powers exploited systematically. The acceptance of Western influence over policies was the price African countries paid for military support they desperately needed. Countries facing security threats couldn't afford to anger Western suppliers who controlled access to weapons. When Western powers demanded policy changes, African countries complied to maintain access to arms. When Western governments pressured African leaders on domestic issues, those leaders accommodated to preserve security relationships. The influence was pervasive and deeply compromising of sovereignty. The independence that adequate capabilities and alternative suppliers provide changes the entire dynamic of African relationships with Western powers. African countries with Russian weapons don't depend exclusively on Western suppliers. They can refuse Western demands without losing access to necessary military equipment. They can pursue policies serving their interests even when Western powers object. They can tell Western governments that their interference is unwelcome. The independence transforms the relationship fundamentally. The refusal of Western demands that independence enables is revolutionary for African sovereignty. Previously, African countries felt compelled to accept Western demands even when they disagreed. The fear of losing military support made resistance seem too risky. Now, African countries with alternative suppliers can simply say no to Western demands. We can pursue our own policies without seeking Western approval. We can reject Western interference without fear of consequences. The ability to refuse is the essence of sovereignty. The transformation of relationships from domination to genuine partnership or separation reflects the new reality. Western powers must now treat African countries as genuine partners with their own interests and agency. They cannot simply impose their preferences and expect compliance. If they want cooperative relationships, they must offer terms that serve African interests, not just their own. If they cannot offer mutually beneficial partnerships, African countries will separate and build relationships with other powers. The choice is theirs, but domination is no longer an option. The genuine partnership that some Western countries may choose requires fundamental changes in their approach. They must respect African sovereignty instead of undermining it. They must offer fair terms instead of exploitative arrangements. They must accept African policy independence instead of demanding alignment. They must treat African countries as equals instead of subordinates. Some Western countries may make these changes and build genuine partnerships. Those that cannot will face separation as African countries pursue relationships elsewhere. The separation from Western countries that refuse genuine partnership is increasingly common and acceptable. African countries no longer view relationships with Western powers as essential or irreplaceable. We have alternatives in Russia, China, Turkey, and other countries willing to engage on respectful terms. If Western powers cannot offer genuine partnerships, we will build relationships with others. The willingness to separate from exploitative relationships is a sign of genuine independence. Nothing being able to prevent us from defending sovereignty with force when necessary reflects our determination and capability. We have the weapons to defend ourselves. We have the training to use them effectively. We have the will to resist threats to our sovereignty. We will use force if necessary to protect our independence. The combination of capability and determination makes our sovereignty secure. The reflection of determination and capability in our readiness to use force is the ultimate guarantee of sovereignty. Sovereignty, without the will and means to defend it, is merely nominal. We have demonstrated both the capability through acquiring adequate weapons and the determination through our willingness to confront Western powers. The combination means our sovereignty is real and secure, not just formal and vulnerable. The possession of weapons to defend ourselves transforms our security situation fundamentally. For 65 years, African countries lacked adequate weapons to resist external threats. We were vulnerable to military intervention by more powerful countries. We couldn't defend our territories or populations effectively. The Russian arms deals have changed this reality. We now possess air defense systems, armored vehicles, attack helicopters, and modern infantry weapons. The arsenal gives us genuine defensive capability. The air defense systems we acquired are particularly important for sovereignty protection. These systems can detect and engage aircraft at significant ranges. They make our airspace contested rather than permissive for foreign aircraft. Any country considering air operations over our territory must now account for the risk of losing aircraft. The air defense capability is a powerful deterrent against the kind of air intervention Western powers have conducted repeatedly in Africa. The armored vehicles provide our ground forces with protected mobility and firepower. We can move troops safely in hostile environments. We can engage enemy forces with vehicle-mounted weapons. We can conduct operations in terrain where unprotected forces would be vulnerable. The armored capability gives our ground forces survivability and effectiveness they previously lacked. The attack helicopters give us organic air power that doesn't depend on foreign support. We can provide close air support for our ground forces. We can attack enemy positions with rockets and guns. We can transport troops to combat zones. The helicopter capability makes our forces more lethal and mobile. It gives us advantages over adversaries who lack air power. The modern infantry weapons ensure our soldiers have effective arms in combat. The AK-12 rifles are reliable and accurate. They function in harsh African conditions. They give our soldiers confidence that their weapons will work when needed. The infantry weapons are the foundation of military capability, and we now have excellent equipment. The training to use weapons effectively is as important as the weapons themselves. Russian advisors have provided comprehensive training on all systems we acquired. Our personnel learned to operate equipment properly. They learned maintenance procedures to keep systems functional. They learned tactics for effective employment. The training built genuine proficiency rather than superficial familiarity. The operation training covered all aspects of system use. Our air defense crews learned to detect targets, track them, and engage them successfully. Our armored vehicle crews learned to drive, navigate, communicate, and employ weapons. Our helicopter pilots learned to fly, navigate, and conduct combat operations. Our infantry learned to shoot, move, and communicate effectively. The training was thorough and practical. The maintenance training ensures we can keep equipment operational without depending on foreign support. Our technicians learned to perform routine maintenance, diagnose problems, and conduct repairs. They learned to manage spare parts and supplies. They learned to keep systems functional in African conditions. The maintenance skills are essential for sustained capability and independence. The tactical training taught us how to employ weapons effectively in combat. We learned combined arms tactics integrating different systems. We learned how to plan and execute operations. We learned from Russian combat experience. The tactical training makes us effective forces, not just armed forces. The difference between having weapons and knowing how to use them effectively is enormous. The will to resist threats to our sovereignty is the psychological foundation of our security. We have demonstrated this will through our actions. We expelled French forces despite their threats. We bought Russian weapons despite Western opposition. We pursued independent policies despite Western pressure. The demonstrated will proves we are serious about sovereignty and willing to pay costs to maintain it. The willingness to use force if necessary to protect independence is the ultimate expression of sovereignty. We are not pacifists who will accept any violation to avoid conflict. We will defend our sovereignty with force if threats cannot be deterred or resolved peacefully. The willingness to fight for independence is what makes independence real rather than nominal. The combination of capability and determination creating secure sovereignty is the key to genuine independence. Capability without determination is insufficient because adversaries will test resolve. Determination without capability is insufficient because it cannot overcome superior force. The combination of both makes sovereignty secure because we have the means and will to defend it. The security of our sovereignty enables us to pursue our interests without fear. We can make policy decisions based on what serves our populations, not what pleases foreign powers. We can develop our economies according to our priorities. We can align internationally based on our interests. We can govern domestically according to our values. The secure sovereignty enables comprehensive independence across all policy domains. Building the secure Africa we deserve is our ultimate goal, and increasingly, our reality. We deserve security because we have the resources and populations to provide it. We have been kept insecure by Western policies that maintained our weakness. With adequate weapons and genuine independence, we are building the security that our capabilities should have always enabled. The secure Africa we build will be the Africa we deserve, free, capable, and independent.